J.R.R. Tolkien was not a fan of the concept of biography. In fact, he once called investigation into an author's life an entirely vain and false approach to his works. But he wrote that passage in a letter, one that was published along with over 350 others in a volume called The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. This collection was edited and compiled by Tolkien's official biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, and his youngest son, Christopher, and it gives us a shockingly intimate look into Tolkien's day-to-day life. These letters are most often brought up when it comes to conversations about the deep lore of his stories, because within them, Tolkien did talk a lot about Middle-earth, making some points and clarifications that can't be found in any of his other published works. But as interesting as all of that in-universe information is, I think that the most fascinating parts of these letters are what lies between the lore. Tolkien, during his life, was a remarkably private man, but through these letters, you begin to get a sense of what his true voice may have sounded like, what he sounded like speaking to his fans, his friends, or even his children. This book presents to us Tolkien stripped of his layers of fantasy storytelling allegory, or the armor of academic writing. They are largely unedited and unfiltered, and as far as we can tell, true to the person that he was at the moment of writing. Through these letters, we are permitted, briefly, and in a limited capacity, to see Tolkien not as he wanted to be seen, or as the public perceived him, but as he truly was, at least through the lens of the letter. I know that most people, including often myself, treat this collection as more of a reference text than a novel to be read for enjoyment, but today I want to talk you through what these letters cover, and some of the most important moments of Tolkien's life that they permit us entrance to. But first, allow me just a moment to tell you about this video's sponsor, ZocDoc. I don't know how things have been going for you this summer, but between record-breaking heat, lettuce that can do terrible things to you, and smoke-ridden air, I have not been feeling the best about my health. My health anxiety has been at an all-time high, and I never quite know if I'm sick or if I should go to a doctor, and it has been so great knowing that this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, is here to keep me sane. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. From primary care to dentistry, eye care, skin care, and nearly everything in between. They have more than 150,000 healthcare providers across all 50 states, and they make it easy to book in-network appointments for whatever type of care that you need. And there's no need to call doctors' offices and wait on hold either. With ZocDoc, you can do everything online. Once you've found the doctor you need, you can click to see their actual appointment openings. ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even make same-day appointments. ZocDoc lets you filter for doctors by insurance, location, and specialties, and you can see reviews by real, verified patients, so that you can choose the best and most convenient care for you. From primary care to dental health, eye care to urgent care to mental health, and more, it is the one-stop shop for all your healthcare needs. Your health matters, and ZocDoc can help you get the care that you need. Just go to ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That is ZocDoc.com/JessOfTheShire to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thanks so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien were published posthumously in 1981, and they were pieced together from the records that Tolkien and his family kept, and from the submissions of other people who had received letters from him. The first one is from 1914, when Tolkien would have been about 22 years old, and the final dates from 4 days before his death, when he was 81. Although they are a bit spotty, especially in their early coverage, these letters encompass almost the entirety of Tolkien's adult life, from his wartime to his married life and into retirement. And in an era where letters were one of the best ways to communicate over distance, a lifetime of letters meant that there were a lot of letters to sort through. The original publication of this collection actually had to cut out quite a bit of material for length because it was simply too long of a book. So Christopher Tolkien and Humphrey Carpenter chose to prioritize the letters wherein Tolkien discusses his own works. Fortunately, in 2023, they released a revised and expanded version of this text, with over 150 new letters included, and a lot of meat added back into the letters that were cut down for that first edition. I personally really appreciate the way that this new edition treasures the things that Tolkien talked about beyond the things that he was writing, so it is that version that I'll be discussing today. The first 4 letters of the book are correspondences between Tolkien and his wife Edith, and they're actually the only letters we get from them as a couple. There's probably a few different reasons for that. One, the two of them lived together for most of their adult lives, so there wasn't typically a need for letters, and I also believe that this was done to protect their privacy. These first 4 letters take place in Tolkien's final years at Oxford University and his preparations for the army. In these pages, we can find the roots of the Silmarillion beginning to set. He tells Edith about his character Eärendil, who would come to be a central figure of his myth. In 1915, he writes about his poem Cortirion Among the Trees, which he composed for Edith, inspired by Warwickshire, where she lived. The poem blends the concept of an ancient city in a mysterious forest with mentions of things like the Edain, a term he would come to use to describe the elves of his mythos. In his letter, Tolkien encloses a copy of the poem and asks that Edith send it along to his school friends, which were in a club that they called the TCBS. This particular detail highlights one of the things that I find most interesting about communicating 100 years ago. Sharing stories took a lot of effort. Nowadays, when we have a project we want to share with someone, we can make unlimited copies of it with a click of a button. But for Tolkien, a poor student in 1914, if he wanted to share a poem with his wife, he had to send her possibly the only copy that he had. And if he wanted his friends to see that copy as well, he had to ask her to send it along to one of them, who would hopefully send it on to the next person, and so on and so on. In his letter to Edith, Tolkien tells her that he's sending her a nicely written pencil copy of Cortirion Among the Trees for her to send on to his friends once she's finished reading it, and that a typewritten copy, done by Tolkien, will be sent along for her to keep when he can find the time to write it. By the end of the letter, he changes his mind, telling her to keep the pencil-written copy. His friends can wait. Because of the particular challenges endemic to this kind of communication, these letters become something precious, far more than just a means of communication. Tolkien speaks of owing his friends longer letters. This was long before you could blast out a message to your 8 closest friends in a group chat or post a status update on Facebook. Communication was something that required concerted effort, thought, and composure, and they would find that during wartime, this kind of very thoughtful communication proved essential. Tolkien shipped out to France with the Lancashire Fusiliers the summer of 1916, and he found himself thrown right into the fray of the Battle of the Somme. His closest friends, the members of the TCBS, were not able to be alongside him. They were stationed elsewhere across Europe, also taking part in the war effort. But they clung to each other in the form of the written word, often sending each other's letters and poems and notes onto each other, annotating or underlining them in a kind of shared group conversation. In July of 1916, the first of the TCBS members to die in the war was Rob Gilson. The 5th letter in the book comes a few weeks later, when Geoffrey Bach Smith sent along a letter from Christopher Wiseman, along with word of Gilson's death. In his reply, Tolkien's grief is immediate and raw. He speaks of feeling like something has shattered irreparably with the death of Rob Gilson. He and the members of the TCBS had gotten together just a few months earlier to discuss their future, the art that they would go on to create, the messages that they would share, the ways in which they would change the world. But now, with one of their brothers gone, they found themselves presented with two courses of action: to give up, or to accept that perhaps this loss was meant to be. Tolkien says, "If the greatness, which we three certainly meant, and meant as more than holiness or nobility alone, is really the lot of the TCBS, then the death of any of its members is but a bitter winnowing of those who were not meant to be great, at least directly." He tries to clarify, saying that Rob Gilson was meant for greatness, but a different kind of greatness now that he's passed, but it is a messy and emotional letter. Tolkien doesn't seem to know exactly what it is that he's trying to say. Words on a page cannot fully capture his feelings. He concludes the letter, "I have sat solemnly down and tried to tell you dryly just what I think. I have made it sound very cold and distant, and if it is incoherent, that is due to its being written at different sittings amongst the noise of a very boring company mess. Send it on to Chris if you think it worthwhile. I do not know what is to be our move next, or what is in store." This is the only letter included in the book that comes from Tolkien's time on the front, but it is one that was very specifically chosen. So much of Tolkien's later work would be shaped by the sense of impermanence and loss that he experienced during the war. So to see his feelings crystallized exactly as they were in that moment is quite the gift. This allows you to see Tolkien not as he would become when time and growth had dulled the sting of grief, but this is immediately as he was, warts and confusion and all. And perhaps that honest look at how he was allows us to appreciate all the more the man that he was able to become. Years would pass before there's another letter in the book, but by 1923, Tolkien was beginning his career as a professor. The letters show us his applications for positions at universities and his defense of the art of philology, but also the start of his family life. By the mid-30s, his children were of letter-receiving age, and the letters he sent to them are so wonderfully mundane. To his eldest son, John, who was a teenager off at boarding school, he writes to express his disappointment about his bad grades in Latin. He warns John, "I'm afraid life will become a little grim for you now. You are on the verge of the serious years, in which there is a good deal of work and not so much play. I noticed your German books went back again after a rather quiet holiday in your trunk." Here we can start to see a portrait of how Tolkien was as a father. He wasn't strict per se, but he was deeply concerned with the affairs of his children's lives, especially their education. He wanted what was best for them, or at least what he thought was best for them. However, every one of his letters to his children ends with him wishing God's blessing upon them and saying that he loves them very much. Tolkien has gained quite the reputation of being a bit of a prickly and stodgy old man, but in his letters to his children, you see far beyond that facade. Even in his letters to his children, Tolkien's work inevitably begins to crop up. He started work on The Hobbit in the early 30s, and by 1937 we begin to see correspondences between Tolkien and his publishers, Allen and Unwin. He had been put in contact with them by a former student, Susan Dagnall, and she is the first one he begins speaking to about the details of The Hobbit's printing. This communication soon shifts to being held with Allen and Unwin themselves, and it's in these letters that Tolkien's self-deprecating side shows itself. He sent in an illustrated manuscript of his children's book Mr. Bliss for consideration, but he's very quick to decry his drawings as utterly defective, even as his publishers respond positively to them. Although it doesn't seem like Tolkien was an insecure man on the whole, there are certain recurring quirks you'll find within these letters, and embarrassment over the quality of his drawings was certainly one of them. Tolkien's fastidiousness and perfectionism also shines in these letters. Apparently, he had so many notes and corrections for the first proofs of The Hobbit that they were going to make him pay for the excess corrections, something that he did agree to do pretty reluctantly. When his publishers mention that there's some interest in the book from the American market, possibly with the inclusion of illustrations done by an American artist, Tolkien agrees, as long as that art is not influenced whatsoever by America's Disney studios. He expresses a heartfelt loathing for Disney and all of its works. He volleys back and forth with Allen and Unwin about the specific date of publication for The Hobbit, wishing for it to be done sooner rather than later. He explains that if they wait much longer to publish it, it may look like he's been writing The Hobbit and working on The Hobbit when he was supposed to be doing other things for his job at the university. There are so many parts of these letters that do kind of just feel like business emails, but that's kind of a very grounding thing. Because of all of his very brilliant work, there's an instinct to deify Tolkien, to make him this greater-than-life figure, but these letters make it clear that under all of that brilliance, he was just a man, a scholar and a writer and a worker with strong preferences and dislikes, and a bit of a tendency to get distracted on the job. Between all this business, his children kept growing up, and with his youngest son Christopher now also at school, all of Tolkien's sons were away, and so he communicated with them through letters quite a bit. He tells a 12-year-old Christopher, who's just started school, not to worry too much about sending letters back home, especially as the school year gets busier, and he reminds him not to forget to attend Mass. To his middle child, Michael, Tolkien asks that he keep an eye on his younger brother now that they're in school together, and he offers him some pertinent advice about the rugby team. Apparently Mick, as he calls Michael, didn't make the team this time, but neither did Tolkien when he was his age. Michael, just like his father, will have to bulk up a bit, and then he should be perfectly accepted by the team. In 1937, Tolkien began a direct exchange with Stanley Unwin of Allen and Unwin Publishing, and the two's friendship would only deepen from there. It was Stanley's son Rayner who had been one of The Hobbit's first supporters, writing a glowing book report about it for his father. Under Rayner Unwin's advice, The Hobbit had been published and was doing surprisingly well for itself. Stanley now expresses that although children's book authors typically need a few publications under their belt to gain fame, Tolkien was well on his way to success in just one book. Later that year, Tolkien also shared with Stanley Unwin the first drafts of what would eventually become the Silmarillion. Although the work's strangeness was remarked upon by test readers, Allen and Unwin did not reject the manuscript outright, something that proved to be a great comfort to Tolkien. His response to these notes reads, "My chief joy comes from learning that the Silmarillion is not rejected with scorn. I have suffered a sense of fear and bereavement, quite ridiculous since I let this private and beloved nonsense out, and I think if it had seemed to you to be nonsense, I should have felt really crushed." Since he'd first conceived of this elvish mythology in the trenches of 1915, Tolkien had referred to this work as little more than a mad hobby. But the confidence of his publishers began to break down those barriers, and got Tolkien wondering if someday the Silmarillion might indeed make it to press. On the 19th of December, 1937, upon being told that demand for The Hobbit was requiring a rushed reprint, Tolkien closes his letter thanking them for the information by saying, "I have written the first chapter of a new story about hobbits, a long-expected party." This is the very first mention of what would blossom into The Lord of the Rings. By February of the next year, Tolkien was sending that first chapter to Allen and Unwin to gauge their interest. He had a 13-year-old Christopher Tolkien typing out the chapters since he was sick and staying at home, and The Lord of the Rings seemed to be progressing at a good pace. Tolkien was sharing the story as it evolved with Christopher, of course, and with his friend C.S. Lewis, and the two of them were rather enjoying it, proclaiming it to be even better than The Hobbit. Tolkien asks that Stanley once again enlist the help of his son Rayner as a beta reader for The Hobbit sequel. That summer, some conflict arose when Stanley Unwin was in talks with a German publisher to see about a German translation of The Hobbit. The publisher wrote in to request to know if Tolkien was of Aryan origin. This was 1938 after all, and anti-Semitism was rampant. Tolkien replies to Stanley, saying that he is so upset by this question that he would rather not go forward with a German translation at all. Although he is not Jewish, and in fact has a German last name, Tolkien detests any suggestion that those of non-Jewish origin may be superior to the Jewish people. However, he doesn't want to entirely sabotage the German translation, and so he offers Stanley 2 drafts of letters to be sent in reply. We only have one of these letters remaining, so it is likely that this is the unsent one. Who knows what the one that they sent contained. The unsent letter goes into depth on the exact definition of the term Aryan, because Tolkien will always be linguistically pedantic. And then, Tolkien explains that if they're asking whether he's Jewish or not, the answer is no. He is an English subject. He writes, I have been accustomed, nonetheless, to regard my German name with pride, and continued to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war, in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride. Your enquiry is doubtless made in order to comply with the laws of your own country, but that this should be held to apply to the subjects of another state would be improper, even if it had, as it has not, any bearing whatsoever on the merits of my work, or its suitability for publication, of which you appear to have satisfied yourself without reference to my origin. It's worth noting that because of the nature of these letters, none of these are a fully raw expression of who Tolkien was. Even the most casual of letters comes with a degree of filtering and editing because he's taking his thoughts and writing them down. But this letter, among others, proved that Tolkien was far from a mild-mannered pushover. When provoked, he knew just how to hit back. By the fall of that year, Tolkien was finding that his Hobbit sequel had gotten entirely out of hand. It was spinning far beyond the bounds of being a story for children, and his inspiration for it was starting to run dry. In those interim years between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, you'll find that perfectionism and procrastination blended in Tolkien in equal measures, and caused him a lot of problems. In mid-1939, he agreed to write a foreword for a new translation of Beowulf. Allen and Unwin, over the course of months, sent him multiple letters reminding him that he promised to do this, until Stanley himself had to individually write to Tolkien. In December of that year, Tolkien finally replied, saying that progress had not been made. Then, more than 3 months later, in March, he finally got around to writing something. Needless to say, despite the enthusiasm with which he began his Hobbit sequel, it was not going to be a quick or painless process to finish his masterpiece. Still, life went on. In a letter to Christopher, he discusses how much he's paying his son to help him type out the developing Lord of the Rings, and he also ends the letter with a bit of fatherly advice. P.S. Pity you forgot Mummy's birthday, Tuesday last. Very few men, but practically all women, set great store by dates and anniversaries. It does not follow that the men are wholly in the right about it. Anyway, as a practical lesson in the way to live and conduct one's social affairs smoothly, this difference between the sexes is well worth remembering. A man can avoid a lot of trouble for himself and avoid giving much pain to others by noting it, especially in the case of wives, mothers, sweethearts, and sisters. No great harm done this time, but I had no father to point this out, and have learned the lesson I now pass on only by troublesome experience. It seems that Christopher was the greatest recipient of this fatherly advice, perhaps in part because Christopher was one of the people compiling the book. His advice to Christopher ranges from some slightly dubious comments about the differences of the sexes, to discussing the annoyance of politics, the bureaucracy, and the challenges of being a working author. But war was most certainly brewing, the second war that Tolkien would face in his life. In 1942, Tolkien wrote to Stanley Unwin, wondering if it would even really be possible to publish an epic like The Lord of the Rings in wartime, with attention elsewhere and paper shortages. The majority of the letters that we see from the World War II years are exchanged between Tolkien and Christopher, who had joined the Royal Air Force in 1943. Over the next 3 years of his service, it seems like he was in near constant communication with his father, no matter where in the world the war took him. Edith seemed to take on the responsibility of sharing the family's actual news and important updates, which meant that Tolkien was free to share with his son whatever little pieces of home he pleased. Among notes about The Lord of the Rings and his work as a professor, Tolkien talks about this year's blackberry harvest and the quality of their homemade marmalade. He tells his son about the chickens breaking eggs and who in the family has fallen ill, and commiserates with his son about army inoculations, terrible shifts, and the general drudgery of war. He complains about his favorite pub, the Eagle and Child, being closed when he had made plans to meet there, but then celebrates that he was able to meet with Lewis across the street for 4 pints anyway. In December of 1944, he reported, "I gave myself a pre-Christmas gift in the shape of a pole pruner, a 12-foot scarlet lance with a hook at top, and a pruning knife worked by a handle at bottom. I must have looked a bit odd, cycling back from Goundries in my garden clothes, both knees out and insufficient, screened by an old overcoat, with my red spear at rest. In a swish of wind, I only just missed unhorsing Mrs. Barrington Ward as she ground along on her ancient bicycle. It's a good tool, as I can reach all the trees with it, and most of the holythorn." Wound in and around these mundanities are remarkably profound musings on the nature of man and evil, whether the enemy could really be thought of as fundamentally evil Uruk-hai, and what it meant to keep up one's hobbitry at heart. Tolkien wonders if, by the use of ever-advancing technology, we weren't trying to defeat Sauron using his own ring. And most of all, he wishes that Christopher were still with him, to help him untangle all these thoughts. He mused, "What a lot of work you put into the typing of The Lord of the Rings, and the chapters written out so beautifully. I wish I still had my amanuensis and critic near at hand." While I would genuinely recommend that all Tolkien fans give these letters a full read-through, I think if there was ever a section that is a must-read, it would be those entries between 1942 and 1946. If there was ever something that would humanize someone as great as Tolkien, it would be these letters. I think that possibly because Tolkien had spent his own time away from home in the war effort, he understood how important it was to give Christopher a sense of normalcy, a taste of home. And I think really, in the chaos of war and work and an ever-changing world, he just missed him. In the fall of 1944, he wrote to his son, "I have the autumn wanderlust upon me, and would fain be off with a knapsack on my back and no particular destination, other than a series of quiet inns. One of the 2 long-delayed delights we must promise ourselves, when it pleases God to release us and reunite us, is just such a perambulation together, preferably in mountainous country, not too far from the sea, where the scars of war, felled woods, and bulldozed fields are not too plain to see." The war would eventually come to an end, and then it was time to get back to work. By 1947, Tolkien was giving a finished copy of Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings to Stanley Unwin, who had his son read it. Although Rayner had his qualms about the story, he said that overall it was gripping. Still, that was only Book 1, and it would take another 2 years for The Lord of the Rings to be deemed complete by Tolkien. But by then there was trouble in paradise. Tolkien came into contact with Milton Waldman, a different publisher from his Allen and Unwin, who expressed a great deal of interest, not just in The Lord of the Rings, but also in the Silmarillion. Although the Silmarillion was far from being a complete work, Tolkien had a burning desire to someday see it published, something that he did not foresee happening with Alan and Unwin, thanks to their lackluster reaction to the piece a few years back. Thus, the next few letters navigate Tolkien's effort to intentionally sour his relationship with Alan and Unwin in favor of a new one with Milton Waldman. In his exchanges with Stanley, he discusses The Lord of the Rings as more of a sequel to The Silmarillion than The Hobbit. He disparages the story as unmanageably long and impossible to edit down, and declares that it will need to be published with The Silmarillion in order to make any sense. Rayner Unwin, who had read it, disagreed, and told his father as much, and this letter from Rayner talking about The Lord of the Rings was unwisely sent to Tolkien himself, and this pushed him over the edge. He laid down the ultimatum that Alan and Unwin would either accept The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings as a package deal and agree to publish both of them in their current form, or they would get to publish neither. He needed a yes or a no. Pushed into a corner, it was a no, and his relationship with Stanley Unwin more or less collapsed. This was one of the most compelling parts of Tolkien's story to me. The art itself seems to come so naturally to him, but the business of getting that art put out into the world seems to have been a constant sticking point for him. He was such a deeply passionate man when it came to his works, but that meant that sometimes he was short-sighted and made mistakes. I don't know, it humanizes him a lot to see that he is still an artist, with the ego that tends to come with that. By 1950, The Lord of the Rings was still in limbo. Despite their initial excitement, Milton Waldman dragged their feet in terms of the actual execution of Tolkien's vision. By 1951, there was no movement, and in 1952, they told Tolkien that they were no longer interested in publishing his work. It was just too long and complicated. Later that year, it was Stanley Unwin's son, Rayner, who extended the olive branch to Tolkien, asking him about one of his poems and about his progress with The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien, who had now had a few years to cool off, thanked Rayner for reaching out. He admitted that, at this point, despite still wanting to see the Silmarillion published someday, he'd be happy even just getting to publish The Lord of the Rings in his lifetime. He finished off this letter by saying, "It is a great blessing to have importunate and determined friends who will not let one relapse into permanent silence. I am most grateful to you for writing again." Thus, his relationship with Alan and Unwin was reignited, and they began to move forward on the publication of The Lord of the Rings. In letters, they debate issues of the length of the book, titling, and the cost of production. The original estimate for the cost of the book was at least £3.10 to the customer, which is about £80 today. They tried to figure out how to make the book cheaper, but it was always going to be a bit pricey, something that Tolkien is immensely apologetic about when writing to others about the book in the future. His original suggested titles for the book, if broken into 3 separate entries, were The Shadow Grows, The Ring in the Shadow, and The War of the Ring, or The Return of the King. It seemed the Unwins were more fond of The Return of the King, and a week or two later, they settled on the titles that we know today. Finally, the first book was published in 1954, and reviews began rolling in, and fans were created. Tolkien was actually quite responsive to his readers at this time, going to great lengths to reply to their letters to answer whatever questions they had about his story or world. Here, he begins to go into depth on some of the stories of the Silmarillion, which are touched on by The Lord of the Rings. He gets to explore the nuances of his languages, and dig deep into the meanings and motivations of his stories. But it wasn't all about The Lord of the Rings. At one point, Tolkien was brought into the BBC to do a broadcast reading of his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a medieval story. Despite practicing with Christopher for this reading at home, Tolkien seems to have been quite displeased with the results. In reply to someone writing in to comment on his work, he wrote, "It is really a great work of charity to be so nice to me at this time. As you may guess, I am suffering acutely. I thought the broadcast was awful, and was quite crumpled on Sunday." It seems he had a number of problems with BBC broadcasts, as he also expressed loathing for the broadcasts that they did of a dramatized Lord of the Rings. He concludes, after listening to their broadcast, that his books are quite unsuitable for dramatization. Many people would try and make adaptations of The Lord of the Rings in the following years, and whenever Tolkien was sent the treatments, his reactions were strong and negative. In 1956, Tolkien received a note from a man who was actually named Sam Gamgee. Delighted, Tolkien assures Mr. Gamgee that the character he has been associated with is a good one, and he offers to send Mr. Gamgee signed copies of the books. Days later, he wrote to Christopher, giddy as he explained the encounter. Some of my favorite letters from this time are the long-time correspondences that he held with fans. In 1948, he received his first letter from Hugh Brogan, a schoolboy who was writing about his love for The Hobbit. Tolkien maintained conversations with Brogan up into 1955, talking about everything from the writing of The Lord of the Rings to the works of C.S. Lewis, and even Brogan's annoyance over his voice changing in puberty. In 1956, Tolkien began correspondence with someone named Amy Ronald, which he kept up with until 1970. His letters to her dive deep into the philosophies of his characters, the books that she sent him about botany, and in one letter he even expounds to her the origins of their names, asking that she call him John. Even as busy as Tolkien was, and he often expresses being quite busy in letters, Tolkien's letters show us a man who simply loved getting the chance to share his life with other people. As his fame grew, Tolkien became less and less able to engage with all of the letters sent his way. But well into the 70s, he still found time to write pages-long letters in reply to particularly pertinent questions about the lore of his stories. Now, something that you might not necessarily hear automatically from Tolkien's works is how funny he is, but there are quite a few moments of humor in these letters. In 1960, a Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings was published, and Tolkien had to write to Allen and Unwin because he'd just received another 5 complimentary copies of the book on top of the 5 he'd already been sent. He writes, "I have no objection to this, though they are not going off exactly as hotcakes for presents, as Swedish does not seem to be one of the languages much indulged in England." Or consider the time when he received word from the University of Madras congratulating him on being accepted as a member of their board of examiners. Tolkien replied, "I have to thank you for the honor of appointing me a member of your board of examiners. May I respectfully suggest, nonetheless, that it is inadvisable to do this without first consulting the persons appointed." Tolkien was so famous at this point that he was being accepted to positions he didn't even apply to. And I think that my personal favorite Tolkien anecdote comes from 1965, when Tolkien attended a lecture. Following it, he describes, "After it, the lecturer introduced me to a pleasant young woman who had attended it. Well, but quietly dressed, easy, and agreeable, and we got on quite well. But the lecturer started to laugh, and he said, 'It is obvious neither of you has ever heard of the other before.' Quite true, and I had not supposed that the lady would ever have heard of me. Her name was Ava Gardner, but it still meant nothing till people more aware of the world informed me that she was a film star of some magnitude, and that the press of pressmen and storm of flashbulbs on the steps of the schools were not directed at the lecturer, and certainly not at me, but at her." In his later years, Tolkien began keeping carbon copies of all the letters he wrote, and so the record of his later life is much better maintained. And in these letters, fame seemed to be a double-edged sword. Tolkien celebrates the improved pay and the opportunity to retire. He even gets to send money to his beloved Aunt Jane. He once took a trip to the Netherlands for a festival held in his book's honor and had quite a bit of fun. But there was a darker side to fame too. Tolkien realized his phone number was published in the Oxford Directory, leading to it ringing off the hook. He writes, "Removing the number from the directory seems better than the method adopted by Major W.H. Lewis in protecting his brother, which was to lift the receiver and say Oxford Sewage Disposal Unit, and go on repeating it until they went away. He expresses trepidation over the concept of New York's Tolkien Society, saying that it should instead be called something like the Shire Society, something not specifically related to him, but to his stories. He laments the way that people write to him, trying to squeeze biographical information out of him, like that will reveal the secrets of his work. And of course, how every time he does an interview for the newspaper, he comes out of it looking bad, in his opinion. These letters let us in to see grandchildren's birthdays and the funerals of old friends. He takes trips to the beach and languishes over his brutally slow progress on the Silmarillion. He makes new acquaintances who are able to help him with his work, and reaches out to old ones, taking time to reply to fans whenever possible. Even when writing letters by hand was no longer feasible and phones were readily available, Tolkien kept typing out letters, because they seemed to be the best way he'd found to express himself outside of fiction. The last few years of Tolkien's life are kind of difficult to read, even through the veil of his letters. As he and Edith's health declined, and his work continued to sit there unfinished, Tolkien felt like time had slipped away far too fast. He clings to old friends like Rayner Unwin and to his son Christopher. His beloved Edith passed away in 1971, and although bereft, he tries to see the brightest side of things. He was permitted to move into university accommodations, where despite the circumstances, he writes excitedly about all of the fancy dinners that he's invited to. Tolkien's final letter in the collection is incredibly characteristic of him. He writes to his daughter Priscilla about the terrible time that he's had trying to get down to the beach. Traffic is a mess, he had to wait to be picked up, he had to wait in a lobby, etc., etc. But he ends the letter as such. It is stuffy, sticky, and rainy here at present, but forecasts are more favorable. Tolkien was a man who was deeply prone to despair. He had a very difficult time of life, and you see that in these letters. But you also see that over and over again, he chose to discover joy within that pain. Whenever I'm writing one of these videos, I try and come up with a thesis for it. It gives them structure and meaning beyond just sharing facts that you guys could easily Google. I really struggled to find a thesis for this video. And maybe that's because Tolkien didn't have a thesis. The foreword of the newest edition of the letters describes this collection as the closest that we'll ever get to Tolkien's autobiography, and I would have to gently push back against that point. This would be an incredibly different piece of art if it had been written to be shared. These letters were not composed to be a biography. There's no direction to them, no through line, no overall message to wrap them up neatly. And there is value to that. We will never know Tolkien. He is dead, but in a way he lives between the lines of this text, as it was with his fictional writing, where we can see the shape of him like a shadow cast upon Plato's wall. It is not him exactly as he was, but it allows us the chance to see ourselves in him on a very personal level, in his failure and his pain, and thus also in his greatest triumphs. One of the things that I really adore about these letters, especially those included in this newest edition, is that the most interesting stuff in the book is not about the Lord of the Rings. These letters make it clear that Tolkien's life was not an origin story for his great works. I find that's where a lot of attempted Tolkien biographies go astray. They treat the Lord of the Rings like it was the summation of this man's life, when the reality is that he was so much more than just the author of a novel. He lived an entire lifetime before and after the publication of his books. He was a father, a friend, an artist, a failure, a fallen and broken man who kept on getting back up and managed to change the world, just like he always dreamed he would, in his own special way. In his wartime letter to Geoffrey Box-Smith, with one of his closest friends dead, trapped in the existential horror of one of history's worst battles, Tolkien expressed a desire to become a great instrument in God's hands, a mover, a doer, even an achiever of great things, a beginner, at the very least, of large things. And although The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all the rest of the things he created count as those very large things that he began, I think that these letters show us how much his life, simple, tragic, and often quite silly, was one of the greatest things he ever did. I am a firm believer that you, watching this video right now, doing your laundry or dishes, should read this book from start to finish. There are many, many more lovely, relatable, crazy moments that I wasn't able to cover in this video. There are a lot of books that have been written about Tolkien's life by other people, but if you really want to get to know Tolkien in any serious way, this is the book for you. Let me know in the comments if any of the stuff that I talked about in this video surprised you at all, and shout out in the comments if you actually have read this one before. Go ahead and share this video with the biggest Tolkien nerd in your life, and no, I do not count and you do not count. You have to find someone else. And go ahead and give this video a like because that really helps me out. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.